Hey, how's it going, everyone? How was the intermission?
Good.
Okay, so I've got a couple things tonight, and all of it is for Justine, of course. Justine, would you mind doing the honors of rolling the desert?
What surface did it fall on?
It's up to you. Oh my gosh! Number 5. Actually, it's fine. It's being dramatic. This is Between the Spires, number 5. On the balustrade, a father sights. He stares at the cloaked mountains to the north. Patches of moonlight show through the diseased clouds, illuminating the stillness of the wheat fields just beyond the walls. Animals move. Small specks of black and gray, they move across landscapes. The boy with him holds in his hand a lucky magnet acquired from a recent trip to another village. The man holds an unmarked bottle containing clear liquid. Their cheeks are rosy. There is pointing. There are muffled questions and muffled answers. The ladder down is a combination of rusted metal and weathered wood. It contains a logo of a fist and a rung, the symbol of the Ladder Makers Guild. A city as much vertical as anything else relies on these ladders. Those who cannot make the climb are rooted to the ground with the wheat, the rats, and the air, and it is still, and it is stifling. So, I consulted with a colleague of mine about this reading. Ooze. And Ooze, when I asked Ooze for some good material, like what should I read at this reading for Justine, Ooze responded that it had to be family friendly, it had to be interesting, it had to remind folks of past readings, and a lot of other stuff that I don't have time to talk about. So anyway, this poem was specifically suggested by Ooze, and I will read it for you. Now it is called Slice and Dice Poem for Justine Chan on Justine Chan's book launch event, version 2 for family-friendly performance. The poet prices and spices the poem precisely. The poet dices and sacrifices the poem spicily. The poet entices the poem slightly. The poet sacrifices and prices the poem wisely. The poet spices and dices the poem nicely. The poet spices the poem spicily. The poet spices and prices the poem slightly. The poet entices and sacrifices the poem slightly. The poet sacrifices the poem spicily. The poet entices and prices the poem nicely. The poet dices the poem spicily. The poet entices the poem precisely. The poet prices and dices the poem wisely. The poet sacrifices the poem slightly. The poem is nicely sacrificed and priced by the poet. The poet entices and spices the poem precisely. The poem is nicely diced and spiced by the poet. The poet dices and entices the poem precisely. The poem is slightly diced by the poet. The poet prices the poem spicily. The poet dices and spices the poem spicily. The poet spices the poem slightly. The poet sacrifices the poem wisely. The poem is wisely spiced and sacrificed by the poet. The poet entices and prices the poem spicily. The poem is nicely priced by the poet. The poem is precisely diced and spiced by the poet. The poet entices and dices the poem slightly. The poet spices and dices the poem wisely. The poet dices and sacrifices the poems precisely. The poet sacrifices and entices the poem precisely. The poem is nicely sacrificed and diced by the poet. The poet spices the poem precisely. The poet prices and entices the poem slightly. The poet entices and sacrifices the poem spicily. The poet dices and spices the poem nicely. The poem is diced precisely by the poet. The poet sacrifices and dices the poem spicily. The poem is slightly sacrificed by the poet. The poet entices and spices the poem slightly. The poem is nicely spiced and enticed by the poet. The poet spices and prices the poem spicily. The poet sacrifices the poem precisely. The poem is wisely diced and enticed by the poet. The poet entices and prices the poem precisely. The poem is nicely enticed and sacrificed by the poet. The poet prices the poem slightly. The poem is precisely enticed and sacrificed by the poet. The poet dices and prices the poem spicily. The poem is diced slightly by the poet. The poet spices and dices the poem precisely. The poem is sacrificed slightly diced by the poet. The poem is priced precisely by the poet. The poet entices and dices the poem spicily. The poet spices and the poem wisely. The poem is nicely diced and sacrificed by the poet. If you don't mind, Ooze also provided a commentary. Actually, a lot of commentary. I had to push back a little bit. Yeah, dice it up a little. This list poem describes how the poet manipulates and enhances the poem using different techniques. The poet prices and sacrifices the poem wisely, dices and spices it nicely, and entices and prices it slightly. The poet also sacrifices and entices the poem precisely, spices it spicily, and dices it spicily. The poem is nicely sacrificed, diced, and priced by the poet, and it is also slightly diced and sacrificed. The poet prices and entices the poem spicily, while also spicing and pricing it spicily. The poem is wisely diced and enticed, precisely enticed and sacrificed, and diced slightly by the poet. So this poem, the one that I started with, which is called Between the Spires, is a 20-piece poem for Justine. It is written in response to / homage to the new book. So it is also a mostly private piece that will be given to Justine when I'm done reading the second of the 20 parts. And then Justine can choose to do whatever she wants with it. But Justine, would you please do the honor of rolling the desert, not rolling in the desert, but rolling the desert a second time?
Yes. 7.
Ooh, 7. I don't remember which one 7 is. Oh, yes. Okay. Between the two spires, or between the spires, 7. Keep this up. In the middle of the day, underneath splashes of blue, a sky that dries the mud and makes the birch trees giggle in the breeze. The cook pots come out. Eggs are cracked open, yielding orange yolks. Cast iron is turned into canvas. Vegetables are chopped. Bits of flesh are sprinkled along. Oils and fats are dispersed. The children salivate longingly as they sharpen knives and more obscure cutlery. From behind grates and nooks and crannies, the fat-bellied rats long for a dexterity of younger years. That's myself in this piece, by the way. The sizzling escalates, and the folk stretch in delight. Every third day of the month, feast day, draws a joyous intention. But beyond this ritual of stomach and digestion is a cruel shared secret. Every other day is a day of starvation, longing, gazing into the clouds, hearing those birches scream, hearing the guts scream, dreaming the knives could come out sooner. So, thank you for listening. That was my reading. I'm going to give Justine this poem and also the desert. Enjoy. So now I have the pleasure of introducing Justine. But yes, thank you everyone again for being here tonight. It's now time to introduce our last reader of the evening. The one who we have been waiting for, the one who has been waiting for us, the one who brings forth song through the city, the one who muses and wanders the streets, dashing here, hopping there, the one who has sang at the markets and the wine bars, the garden parks and the living rooms, the one whose eyes trace horizons from upon a trail or behind a wheel, the one whose hands grip stone and bark and clay and sand, pen and thread and guitar wire, the one whose voice cascades and surges, the one who circles and cherishes the center, the one whose book just launched, the one whose poetry is alive and well, Justine Chan. Justine is a poet, a writer, and a singer-songwriter from Chicago. Her writing has appeared in Electric Literature, Baltimore Review, Beecher's, Poetry on Buses, Midwestern Gothic, and elsewhere. She holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of Washington and has worked many seasons as a park ranger with the National Park Service. She currently lives here in Seattle. And on a personal note, I have had the pleasure of and the honor of knowing Justine and her creative work and her creative mind for years. We met in September 2015. I looked in my Gmail account because I couldn't remember. I guess it's been that long. And our first experience together was actually a road trip that might partially show up in the book, to and from Las Vegas, and it was clear we would become lifelong siblings of the desert from then on. It's in her latest book I see that relationship to the vast, feel that connection to the soothe and the scrape of the land and the scape. It's in her latest book, There's a New Pinnacle. At times jubilant and at times forlorn. Something just went in my nose. That's forlorn. Later, when I'm reflecting on this.
Let's see you get that.
No. At times jubilant and at times forlorn, Justine's whirlwind adventures are inspiring and filled with insights from the heart. Justine spurs us on, challenges what forms our commitments and satisfactions. Her poetry is of the landscapes of the American West. It is raw and ecstatic, intoxicating and musical, and it is filled with the textures that can give us meaning, can keep us going. It's a love letter to all the wanderers of the, quote, dreams of the desert, unquote. It is an homage to those who find beauty in the chaos of the city. Should you lose all reasons is a humble, acute call toward relationships and how each of us are always near to some and far from others. I'm very, very excited for Justine and this book. I've been following it for a while, and having looked at it and held it in my hands, it is stunning. I can't wait for you all to experience it, vocally, verbally, etc., here tonight. Please welcome Justine.